Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org for more info, or you can always email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have Gary R Lindberg. We're going to be discussing his amazing book, The Vegetable Grows and the Lion Roars, My Peace Corps Service. Available for purchase through Amazon as well as barnesandnoble.com. But people, listen, if you want to gather everything that Gary has in store, well, do yourself a favor and head directly to his personal site. And that's GaryRLindberg.com. There you'll find more information on Gary himself, more information on this fantastic narrative that we're going to be discussing today, as well as the other book that he has written so far, and hopefully more on the horizon. And we'll get to that other title a little later on in the interview, but that one is called God's Existence, Truth or Fiction, The Answer Revealed. Again, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and GaryRLindberg.com are the places you have to go. And I will say, Gary was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best publishers in the business, Book Savvy International. So if you or anybody you know has a book that they'd like moved, well, give yourself the best gift you could possibly give and move it through Book Savvy. And you can find out more information on them and their fantastic team at booksavvyinternational.com. So without further ado, sit back, strap in, and get ready for a wonderful ride, because I promise you by the time this interview is finished, you're going to run over to his Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and GaryRLindberg.com to purchase this book, to purchase God's Existence, to really continue to stay abreast with everything that he has going on, because it is that profound. Gary, first and foremost, man, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you very much for being a guest with us today. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, Benji, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And it's a pleasure and an honor to talk with you and be on your CBS Radio network.
Gary, you're too kind, man. I appreciate it. The pleasure is all ours. Okay, we're absolutely looking forward to this. I think what you're embarking upon here is great, because the awareness that you're going to be able to really create, right, in the conversations that are going to happen because of this, it's very special. So I'm really looking forward to this. Now, Gary, I know we have a lot of information to cover pertaining to the book, but I'm going to hold off slightly, because before we go into that, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, Benji, I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, moved to Santa Maria after about 7 years, and grew up there, went to schools there. I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, in U.S. history as my major. I volunteered for the Peace Corps, worked in a school gardens project during the 1960s. That is the early years of President John F. Kennedy's new program. While there, I traveled through West and East Africa, including Lagos, Nigeria, the famous mud city of Kano, Nigeria, the fabled city of Timbuktu in Mali, on to Nairobi, Kenya, various game reserves in East Africa, and Mombasa. Then I was drafted after my Peace Corps service, but volunteered for the Navy and served my 4 years and got my Master of Business Administration degree, my MBA in Management and Personnel after that, worked 43 years in human resources, and retired in November 2019 to pursue personal interests.
My goodness, man. Listen, we're going to have to invite you back onto the network, okay? Not to discuss this book in further detail or any other books you write in the future, just to discuss your background, man. My goodness, it is so impressive and wonderfully eclectic. First and foremost, thank you very much for your service in the Navy, protecting our freedoms here in the States. And we are forever, of course, indebted to you and your brothers and sisters in the military alike. So thank you very much for that. I'd love to hear about your background, but of course, Gary, today's anchor is all about your book, The Vegetable Grows and the Lion Roars. Tell us a little bit more about your narrative.
It's a memoir of my experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Ivory Coast, which is located, right between Ghana and Liberia in West Africa. And in the book, I discuss how I applied for the opportunity, how our group trained at UCLA, my project, my daily activities, and the friends I made while I was there. And I described how 3 other guys and I separately taught primary school children how to grow vegetables in the tropical climate. And I also provide some interesting insights into my village garden project during a summer break in the school year. And I describe my travels in West and East Africa during my approved vacation breaks. And so that's a little bit about my book.
Gary, how did you develop your book title and the book cover?
Well, I was thinking about my Peace Corps work and what I wanted to figure out what to say that kind of symbolized that. And I thought about my other activities, especially my travel. And so I decided I would pick the subject of my project as my first part of the title, The Vegetable Grows. It's an allusion to that. And then the second allusion on the back cover is to my travels, and in particular, the safaris, the animal visitations that I made in East Africa. And then for the book cover, I wanted to show a picture on the front cover to show what the book was about, and then on the back cover, another to indicate my other activities. And again, I picked travel. So I sorted through about 1,000 pictures that I took over 50 years ago, and that was about 1,000. I narrowed it down and showed about 50 or 60 pictures in my book and another 100 pages on my website. But I asked some friends to help me to select the pictures for the front cover and the back cover, and that was very helpful. So that's how I developed my book title and book cover.
There you have it. Gary, let's talk about inspiration for a second, man. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I was inspired by 3 basic reasons. First, while I was in the Ivory Coast, I decided to write a diary to remember what I did, because I don't have the best memory in the world. So I wanted to write down, and I wanted to do it on a daily basis. And as I began it, I did do it on a very good daily basis. But as I went along in my service, I kind of got a little bit apart from daily writing. But anyway, the second major influence that inspired me to write, I was telling my family, friends, and neighbors some of my experiences. And after I retired, it occurred to me that other people might enjoy hearing about my stories too. And then the third reason was to respect the mission of the Peace Corps. In addition to performing our service, we were supposed to learn more about the people, the customs and culture of our host country. Mm-hmm. And of course, the reverse is a bit true too, to help them to learn more about us as individuals, and in that way, maybe a little more about our country. This book was a way for me to share my experience with the American people, and to also let them know how wonderful the people were, and to educate our citizens more about their customs and culture, which I think is very important, because we know so little. And those are the factors that inspired me to write my book. Gary,
how did you decide to join the Peace Corps?
Well, that's an interesting little story. While I was at the University of California, Berkeley, as I said, I was majoring in U.S. history. Well, during my senior year, in the fall semester, Sergeant Shriver, the brother-in-law of President John F. Kennedy, came to the Cal campus to recruit volunteers for the Peace Corps. So I went to listen to him, was very impressed, but I decided it wasn't for me. Besides, they probably wouldn't choose me anyway. Then in the spring semester, Sergeant Shriver returned to the Cal campus. Again, I went to his presentation and was again impressed. But this time I decided to challenge the Peace Corps and Sergeant Shriver and apply. So I submitted my application. But I didn't hear from the Peace Corps before the school year ended, and I graduated in June 1965. Because I had graduated, I became eligible for the draft that was going on at that time. I had to decide what to do with my life. So I decided to apply for the Air Force and their officer candidate school. Well, as part of my application process, I had to go to Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is about 25 miles away from Santa Maria, where I grew up. And I spent almost the whole day filling out forms, talking to people, and doing whatever they asked. I got home late in the afternoon and found a large manila envelope sitting on the kitchen table from the Peace Corps. So I started thinking, they're actually going to invite me to join the Peace Corps. Should I do this? Do I really want to do this? And while I was having these doubts, my mother walked up to me at the kitchen table and asked, "You aren't going to do this, are you?" Right away, I turned to her and said, "Yes, I will." And that's how I joined the Peace Corps.
People, listen, I'm telling you, you're going to run on over to Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I'm at the edge of my seat. One more time, we're here on the line with Gary R. Lindberg. We're discussing his amazing book, The Vegetable Grows and the Lion Roars, My Peace Corps Service, available for purchase through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or directly through his personal site, GaryRLindberg.com. Gary, I know that while you were in the Peace Corps, you were actually teaching students in some variation, right? Talk to us about what were some of the techniques that you taught those students?
Yes, well, Benji, I was teaching primary school children, like grades 1 through 6, how to grow vegetables in the tropical climate, which is very different than what we do here in the United States. First, we taught students how to make a planche, which is basically a mound 1 meter by 10 meters. And we also taught them to make the mound or planche perpendicular to the slope of the land, because they had very severe erosive rains that would just cut through the soil like a hot knife through butter. And so that was important to do. And also we taught how to make a pépinière, which is kind of a nursery of delicate plants like tomatoes, lettuce, eggplant. And when you seed a pépinière, you basically sprinkle the seeds across the planche or mound, and then you allow them to grow. And then the third technique is after these delicate plants grow about 4 to 5 inches, you actually transplant them. You dig them up, transplant them, and plant them on a regular planche or mound, so that because they will survive better that way. That's one of the very interesting things that I found there. Mm-hmm. And then we used paillage, which is the French word for mulch, to protect and enrich the soil. We wanted them to conserve the water because it would rain a lot, so you wanted to protect the plants from the erosive rains, but you also wanted to keep some of the moisture in when it didn't rain for a while. And another technique was staking, to hold up, for example, string beans, so that the plants would stay healthy and prevent spoilage because they were touching the ground all the time. So those were the kinds of techniques we were teaching.
Following off of that, with regards to the schools, for the Schools Gardens program, how did you select them?
Well, I was driving from a town called Ganyua, which had basically 5 routes out of town, and I would drive on each of the 5 routes for a day. And as I drove along the route, I would stop at each school along the way and meet the school director and invite him to participate in the Ivorian government's School Gardens program. It wasn't my program. It was the program set up by the Ivorian government. And I explained how I would visit them on a regular basis, demonstrate various gardening techniques to their students, their children, and the responsible teacher who was in charge of the garden. Give them seeds from the agricultural station where I lived, and the agricultural station was directed in part by a United Nations FAO expert who was experimenting with different kinds of seeds to find out which seeds would grow best in that tropical climate. And then I would also, I promised the schools that I would support them in any way I could. So in this way, basically the schools selected themselves by actually creating and sustaining their respective gardens. So it wasn't me trying to force them. I just followed their lead, basically. If they made a lot of efforts, then I put in more effort to support them.
Where did you travel during your approved vacation breaks, Gary?
My travel went through West and East Africa. As I mentioned, I went to Lagos, the capital of Nigeria, then Ibadan, which is really the largest black city in Africa, up to Kaduna in the northern part of the country, and then further up north to the famous mud city of Kano, back down and east to Enugu before returning to Lagos. This was right at the beginning, or just before the beginning of the Nigerian Civil War, so that was rather interesting, and I mentioned that in the book. After I visited Nigeria, I flew on a charter plane that was chartered by a group of volunteers who wanted to go to East Africa. And I decided to go on the flight, even though initially I decided not to do it. But I'm glad I did do it because they didn't have another charter flight the following year. So we flew to Nairobi, and some girls and I rented a car to visit various game reserves, and also to visit the coastal city of Mombasa. And the following year, in my vacation, I traveled overland north up through the Ivory Coast, up to Bamako, the capital of Mali, then on to the fabled city of Timbuktu. And after that, I returned south, then up into Upper Volta, which is now called Burkina Faso, and then south through Ghana before circling back to the Ivory Coast, and specifically to Ganyua, where I figured that journey covered an estimated 2,500 miles. So those are the kind of travels that I did.
You have it. Now, sticking with the travels, I know a really interesting travel story that you have. There was a time that you and the girls that you were traveling with got stuck. Your car got stuck in the middle of nowhere. Gary, talk to us a little bit about that story, please.
Well, that story was probably a highlight of the whole trip, because when we arrived, our charter plane arrived in Nairobi. I was trying to think of where was I going to go and what was I going to do. And these girls, about 4 of them, walked up to me and said, "Would you accompany us?" And because you're a guy and you probably know more about cars than we know. And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about cars." And they said, "Well, you're a guy. You probably know something." "No, I don't know anything." And but you're a guy. We feel more comfortable if you join us. I said, "Well, okay, I'll join you." So together we rented a Ford Zephyr and traveled to the Nairobi National Park, went through all the animals there, and then on to Amboseli National Park, and then on to Serengeti in Tanzania. As we left Tanzania, we were traveling on this really nice but still dirt road, and we saw this little sign that was like maybe 8 by 10. I don't know if it was that large, but it said Olduvai Gorge to the left. And one of the girls in the group wanted to visit Olduvai Gorge, where the Leakeys had discovered the oldest remains of humans. And so it was very important for her to do that. So we turned off the main road and traveled on this little country road, so to speak, and got winding around and got kind of into some hills, and then our car overheated. Well, when our car overheated, we had to stop. And like I said, I don't know anything about cars. So what did I do? I lifted up the hood and opened up the radiator. All the water sprayed out.
Oh, no.
And there we were, stuck. If we had a little bit of water before, I don't know that we had any after I finished. And so obviously you can't drive the car in the middle of this 95 degree heat or whatever it was. And so we a couple of girls and I decided to gather up some of these 6-ounce Coke bottles and water bottles that we were carrying and had used, and started walking off in one direction. We just picked a direction and went with it and walked several miles. Finally, we got to a little sign that said Olduvai Gorge, another 5 miles. And we were getting a little far away from the car, and we didn't have a compass. We didn't know where we were going or how we were going to get there, and we didn't know if we could get back. And So we decided not to go on to as the sign said, but to return back to the car. Well, when we got back to the car, which we luckily found, we were standing around waiting and trying to figure things out. And then we saw a couple of Maasai herdsmen, or we thought they were Maasai. They were a couple of herdsmen. And we wanted to ask them for some water. Well, we don't know their language. So one of the girls had a English Swahili dictionary. Mm-hmm. So she looked up the word for water. And so we walked over to one of the herdsmen and in our best Swahili, we don't know whether the accent's right, whether the first syllable should be emphasized or the second syllable should be emphasized. We didn't know any of that kind of knowledge. And so we just walked up to him and said, Lakwa, Lakwa. And he stared at us. And we said, Lakwa, Lakwa. And he stared at us. And finally, we started negotiating a price. And he wanted some shillings. So I guess he kind of understood. And so he said, shilling Lakwa. And I said, no, Lakwa shilling. So finally he agreed. And he started walking off, running almost like a run. And so we grabbed our bottles and tore out after him. And we're walking mile after mile. By this time, it's getting darker. And we just finished traveling through all these game reserves. So we knew that wild animals are all around. We don't know what time they're coming out, but it's getting darker as we walked further and further. We kept walking and walking, and we get up to the man who had stopped, and he looked down, and there was a mud hole, and it had a little bit of water in it. So we dipped our Coke bottles, which aren't well designed for scooping up water in a mud hole, and pick up the water as best we can, trying to not take as much mud as we were getting. And so we filled it up as best we could, all the bottles, and then carried it back to our car, paid him his shillings that he asked for, and poured the water and mud into the radiator. I don't know what kind of damage that caused the radiator, but we poured it in there, got back in the car, just as dusk is settling in, and drove back to the main road. And then we were off the main road maybe 10 miles or so. About halfway back, our car overheated again. And this time I said, I'm not stopping. I'm going regardless. And so I got back to the main road, started traveling towards Ngorongoro Crater, another game reserve there, which is very interesting. And we happened to see a corral in the right side of the road. And I drove up the slope to the corral on the left side of it. And we got out, and in our best Swahili again, we're say, Lakwa, Lakwa. And the people inside, the herdsmen who had this thorn corral all around them and all their cattle, motioned us to come around to the opposite side. So we went around 180 degrees to the opposite side. They lifted up portions of the fence and basically created an entrance for us to get in there. And we said, Lakwa, Lakwa. After we negotiated a little bit on a price, they gave us all the clean, clear water we wanted. And I was stunned that they were so generous in giving us out water, because we understood that was survival for them. Mm-hmm. That was not only survival for them, it was survival for their cattle and goats that they had. And it was just amazing. They even gave us extra water to carry with us. And we got back poured it into the water into the radiator and filled it up, and drove back to the room, or the headquarters for the Ngorongoro Crater, and saw a bunch of friends we knew before and had visited before, and we spilled all our story out to them and explained all that happened. But that was the biggest scary moment, because we might not have survived that.
Absolutely. People, listen, we've covered 2 stories? The book is littered with them. You know what? Listen, last question here for you, Gary. What's next for you? This book is incredible. Man, we know you have another one that's already out and has been published. What's on the horizon?
Well, I want to promote my 2 books, The Vegetable Grows and The Lion Roars, and God's Existence, Truth or Fiction, The Answer Revealed. And so I'm going to focus more on promotion right now, but I am thinking of writing a sequel to my first book. And so I think that'll be interesting. In my first book, I make the point that science and the Bible basically say the same thing because both were created by God. And I will explore that theory a little more in detail in my next book.
I absolutely love it. And you know what I love even more is we are at the end of the interview now. We've covered so much information, and yet somehow we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much left to be discovered. As I mentioned, we've only covered a few of the stories. The book is littered with them. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, GaryRLindberg.com are the places you have to go. The Vegetable Grows and the Lion Roars, My Peace Corps Service is the title you have to pick up. While you're there, also look into his other book, God's Existence, Truth or Fiction, The Answer Revealed. And make sure that you're checking in frequently for any upcoming books that Gary has in store. You surely will not be disappointed. Gary, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. Such an honor. I truly mean that. Thank you once again for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Well, thank you, Benji. I thank you for the time you took to talk with me, and it was a real pleasure and honor to be with you.